Thank you, Bob, and thank you everybody for having me today. I know I'm not going to do justice to the story I'm going to try to tell, and I'll talk about that a little bit because that has to do with the artifacts that we have to work from. And I did confess to Lucy here, I feel a little nervous that this is like a PhD dissertation for all the folks that have soaked the history of Wadsworth into their bones, that I may be wrong about some things. So that I want to also make sure that as we start this as a dialogue, because I will learn from you as well. I'm the 9th director of Wadsworth Public Library, and I'm the 4th longest serving, I will say. I'm getting close to tying with Robert Sechrist. Did anybody remember Robert Sechrist? And then after him, there was, next up was Alan Nichols, who many of you know, recently worked with him. If we can call, as I would, 13 years recently. And then after that is the legendary Alice Woodard. And I only know her from the stories people have told me about her, particularly Caesar Carino had a lot to say about Alice, and I'll share a little bit of that as we get into things. But starting from the very beginning, the beginning of library service in Wadsworth is the pioneer era. And I'm sure you've read before, we have the great book by Eleanor Shapiro as our kind of source book here in Wadsworth. But she has a little section about the first circulating library that came by way of Judge Frederick Brown and his wife Chloe Pettibone Brown, who brought it here on a horse-drawn wagon 600 miles in February to bring books to Wadsworth. That's how important it was to get books at the very beginning. So we've got to go back in time and to pioneers struggling to clear the land. And I know through talking to members of the Venner family who, and I don't know if they've talked to you about this or anybody shared with you, there's actually a family journal that they have of the first couple winters living underneath lean-tos and the recently felled trees. So we're not that far away from that very beginning early struggle, and books are a priority. I think that's an important thing to remember. There's another conversation to have, and I have this slide here that I have to skip over because we're not going to talk about what this is tonight. But it is an important conversation about the role of print technology and the way that print technology and book culture played such a vital role in shaping the American mind, the American sense of identity and purpose, and how that all really radically changed in the 1800s, and industrialization has a part to play in that. If we get to that, and we have enough time to talk about that, I do want to come back to that. The reason I'm pushing it to the end is that we really don't know very much about what was happening with library circulation and book sharing in Wadsworth during that period of the 1800s. And Eleanor Shapiro even talks about the period from 1840 to 1860 as kind of like a quiet period where there's really no record of anything. And she chalks that up to it just being a stable farming community where the farms were finally established. There was a little town, there was local commerce. It was a sustainable, self-contained community, which you might even think maybe if we go down to Holmes County and visit some of the Amish towns, that might give us some sense of what Wadsworth was in that 20-year period. But then things start changing. 1860 through the rest of that century, that's when we start to have written records about Wadsworth, and that's when we have now, we've had it on microfilm for generations now it's digitized, access to those newspapers from the very beginning. When you look at those books that came from the Browns, I think that gives you the template of how circulation was sustained, and I want to believe that it was sustained on some level, though we can't say for sure. So they established a little lending library, and they called it the Wadsworth Library Association. And it's my guess that things like that continued until the early 20th century, and we do know by the time you get to the 20th century, we know for sure that there were various different groups involved with lending books in Wadsworth. They were usually the women's federations and other community groups. I have trouble finding there are no images that we've found of the early groups who were involved in lending or the Wadsworth Federation of Women's Clubs. If anybody has that photo, we would love to get that photo. But I just took a glimpse of whatever we could get from the late 1800s of just people in Wadsworth. These are students. This is a club at, I believe this was the Lutheran Church up here. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Does those pipe organs look familiar to anybody? And I included down here this image of E.J. Young and his wife and some of their friends, because they were so important in the establishment of the early library. And so I think of that first period as that's the pioneer era. We don't know very much about what books were doing back then. And then I think you could divide, and if there are any professional historians in the room, forgive me for using these words loosely, that you could divide the library's history into kind of three eras, or reading in Wadsworth into three eras: the pioneer era, and then the early industrial period, which we'll talk about next, and then what I think of as the modern period, when things begin to professionalize. But at that beginning of that early industrial period, this is when we start to know a lot about what's happening with books, running up to the actual formation of the library itself. We start to learn about the nomadic character of a forming library that's now having an identity, and it's moving between different buildings. It's on the second floor of the CIS building at one point. Between 1920 and 25, it is in the second floor of the Albrecht building, which then became is now known as the O'Neill building. In that same building, it moved down the hall to a mayor's office, and his name is I forgot to write down his name, but I remember Caesar talking at length about the way that this mayor was gregarious, and he used the library as kind of a tool for building his campaign. So everybody came to the office to get their books, and he was there, and he would chat them up. And then the library was even in the offices in what used to be the Masonic Temple building that came down shortly after I came to town here in 2013. All this leads up to the actual formation of a public library, but what connects it to the very beginning in the pioneer phase and the establishment of the library itself is the role of women in the community who took it upon themselves to make this happen, often with a strong interest in educating young folks from whether it was the agrarian age of the community as it became more industrialized. Lifting people up through reading and access to books was a project of the women of our community, largely, driven by them. And unfortunately, I try to find out all of their names, but they're usually referred to as Mrs. Edward and Mrs. So we can't really get that deep into who they were based on the records that we have. But that's what leads us to this library, and it is the donation of Ella M. Everhard that bought the first building. And that stunning picture that was reformatted by Ideal Graphics here in town. And it looks like she's gonna just turn and start talking to you. Ella never had children. She was a school teacher by trade, but really her heart was in philanthropy and in advocating for literacy. Not only did she donate the first home that was the library's home, but she also made it a priority as one of the first trustees of this new and first publicly funded library to make sure that the library was connected, that it was doing more than books right from the beginning. The Girl Scouts were meeting there. The Boy Scouts in town were part of like an unpaid janitorial patrol. They would come in and work under the direction of a city janitor who didn't have time to do all of the work. So she was already reaching out to them. I'm told, and I don't know much about it, it seems very mysterious, that the second floor of the library was off limits at first. Does anybody know these stories?
I honestly don't remember going upstairs.
Okay.
I just remember it on the first floor.
Okay. So I understand that this is where the Wadsworth Federation of Women's Clubs continued to meet. And so they had a kind of VIP presence in the early library. The first year of the library then, so the house was bought in 1925 and at a cost of $17,000 by the Everhards and donated. And then it opened on January 15th, so when we had our party back on the 18th of January this year, last month, we were almost literally 100 years from that opening. That first year was a really dynamic one. Within the first few months, they raised $3,000 through donations from people just visiting the library. That's $52,000 in today's money, roughly. And hired the first librarian at Mrs. Alice Woodard at a salary of $100 a month. She would end up serving the library for 32 years, retiring in December of 1958. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that's a very long time. And certainly she left a really deep impact on the folks who use the library in this community. The library was a quiet place when Mrs. Woodard was the head librarian here at the library. Caesar used to love to talk about how strict the book limits were. You could have two books. Children were allowed to have 2 books, except during the school year when they could have 1. Do the math on that. And then the books could be rented for a fee. So things were tight budgetarily at the beginning. But I mentioned always a collaboration from the very beginning. By the end of the first year, there were 4,341 books in the collection. And those books had circulated 32,000 times, which is pretty impressive for a very small, but growing community. A year later, so 2 years later, in 1928, what I call the Woolbach saga begins. How many of you are familiar with the T.D. Woolbach collections? Okay, so in 1928, this is when, so T.D. Woolbach was a former Civil War hero, former Wadsworth mayor for 2 years. I think it was 1891 and 1892 that he was mayor. He was much loved in the community, and he had left a collection of prolific postcards. Some historians, Ohio historians, believe that his postcards are the most comprehensive photographic record of these cities and places in Ohio in that time period when he was doing this work. Most of them are missing. We don't know where most of them are. But he also collected native artifacts and Civil War memorabilia, and the city couldn't say no to accepting his gift, but did not have a place to host it, and so it ended up at the library. Who remembers the T.D. Woolbach Museum in the back of the library? Does that sound familiar to anybody? That's where the arrowheads and everything were. Yeah, and those wooden cases with the glass, those were built at the injector factory for the library.
They got moved to Medina, didn't they?
That's right. Yeah, they're now, and that's another part of the Woolbach saga. They're in Medina now. People that I've talked to about this over the years, we've always talked about, well, how could the library or the community get these artifacts back, and should we? And we'll get to that a little bit later. But I want to mention something about Woolbach that's really interesting. In doing research for this presentation and for our timeline outside, we didn't end up getting to include this, but he actually was also a prolific author. He wrote 72 articles documenting the life and campaign of his Ohio 16th Voluntary Regiment during the Civil War. And it is believed to be one of the most comprehensive documentations, and this is a theme with this guy, of any one Civil War regiment that came from Ohio. They were published in the Holmes County Republican Journal, and they are available at the Holmes County Public Library. And I can send you a link if you're interested. They're online now. They've been transcribed from the printed text, but he wrote under the pseudonym Hatchet. And some local historians were able to connect the dots and connect this stuff to him, and that has been validated. So T.D. Woolbach is an interesting person who had a role in helping to build the library's collection and brought different things into the library that wouldn't usually be there, like shrunken heads. Do you remember the shrunken heads?
I remember a lot of it.
Yeah, and there were skulls and bones, and Caesar Carino told me the story, and this is jumping into the future, during, I think it was the 40s or 50s, maybe it was earlier than that, that kids used to sneak into the library at night before the age of security cameras and alarm systems and play with the artifacts. So the police in Wadsworth are constantly being called because some innocent lady opened up her front door and found a bone, and it's from the library museum again. So the library, T.D. Wolbach had a different kind of impact than he probably expected he was going to have on the community with that collection. That's a big aside. So, pardon me, I don't want to lose my space here. So at the end of the 1920s, the library starts to feel some of the tremors of financial things to come. Story time was canceled in 1927 and returned again in 1929 through volunteers. So this is something we see on and off between the 1920s and the 1970s even. You're still having some of the roles that are delivered today by library staff were delivered by volunteers in the community, usually from the women's federations. In the 1930s, circulation hit an all-time high of 56,000 items circulated. And at the same year, the library became a school district library, which transferred the taxing authority from the township to the schools. That's the kind of library that we are today. That opened up a different kind of avenue for turning to the public to talk about what the library does. It helped to cement partnerships between the library and the schools, which continue to this day. And we don't get too far into the 30s until Wadsworth starts to feel the pinch more acutely during the Great Depression. And it was in 1932 that the library had to cut its hours, and by October of that year was in considerable debt. The city provided a tax infusion in partnership with the school board. They got together and decided that something had to happen. And so they found a way to both dig into their reserves to resuscitate the library and to get it to reopen again. And so in 1933, things were starting to turn around, and then the state of Ohio had passed a tax reform package in 1931 that had a delayed impact and took away about 70% of the library's budget that it was receiving from the state. The library shut down again. And then by August, the Senate and state legislature had corrected that bill, and the library reopened, and they were able to get back pay for the money that was lost. So there are libraries that shuttered for years during the Great Depression, but because of the people who stepped up to the plate in Wadsworth and donated personally, and then the assistance of the other taxing authorities in Wadsworth, library service basically was sustained for the most part. And by the time you get to 1934, the hours are back to normal again, even though we're still struggling as a nation to work our way through the Depression. In 1935, the city built a new building to house the Wolbach collection, but then decided that they didn't want it. So the library continued to serve that collection here.
What were in the bags there?
That was the Salvation Army getting food donations for the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, help families in need. So in the 1940s, during the war years, things are fairly quiet here at the library. Ella M. Everhard passed away in 1943, and she left an additional $5,000 donation that was to be invested for a future building. By this time, the library's growth and use of the library has expanded so much that they already know that at some point we're going to have to do something, and we're not going to be able to make it work in this house. They had gutted the kitchen and turned it into an extension of the collection areas, and were basically using every inch of the house they could use for circulating materials and areas to study and read. So in 1949, at the end of that decade, the library budget grew to $10,000 per year for the first time. To give you perspective, the library's budget now is about $3.2 million per year. During the 40s, you start to begin to see we're starting to transition from the kind of industrial library to the beginnings of what I would say is the modern period. And that begins with, at the very head of the 1950s, well, let me just back up here. I'm getting a little scattered, I apologize. This here is Ramona Medley. Does anybody know Ramona? Ramona was hired as the library's very first student page in the 40s, and she joined us at our 100th anniversary. We have a picture of her together, and I'll show you at the end, of her standing at the picture, and she was the third ever employee of the library. So you think about these first, the 1920s and the 30s, it was mostly just Alice Woodard and volunteers and one other staff member. She's the third ever employee to work with the library, so 20 years with 2 people. At the beginning of the 50s, and I just put this picture up of these gentlemen just to recognize in the 1940s we were sending our boys away to fight in a world war. The library was fairly quiet at that time, but certainly the community was connected to what was happening outside. In the 1950s, things start to really change. Ohio Revised Code had changed in ways that allowed libraries and other subdivisions to seek bond levies in new and more flexible ways in order to grow. The country was growing. We're in the post-war years now. At that time, in 1951, the levy to raise $200,000 to build this library was passed by the public. But it wasn't a shoo-in because there was some question about whether the deed to the property, which against Ella M. Everhard's wishes, said that the library would forever be called Ella M. Everhard Public Library, whether if the building was demolished, that the library could still have the property. And so there was a legal process that the library had to go through after the public had already agreed to spend the money. They spent 2 years in a legal process to determine that they could actually take the house down and build a new building. And that construction then, after they finally found out that it was possible and did what was necessary to do that, the construction began in 1955. And so that we have some pictures that I don't have here of the house coming down, just one demo of the house coming down. That construction took 1.5 years to 2 years, and in 1957, the new building, designed by architects William Boyd Huff and constructed by Theodore Bogner in Worcester, finally opened up. And these are some of those pictures from the early library in the 50s. Totally different place. So the library, after expanding the building, the library considered spending nearly $500 to build a new display for the Woolbach collection. And at that time, this is when both the library and the city together decided that they were no longer in the business of hosting the Woolbach collection. There are many stories about how this happened, and I don't know how much of it, what the actual truth is. But there are stories of the library and the city putting the items out on the curb, and the Medina County Historical Society coming to take the items. and then only later officially transferring them with a motion. We don't know exactly. If you look at just the newspaper accounts, that would not be the case. The newspaper accounts will just tell you that in 1958, the city of Wadsworth passed a motion to transfer the ownership of the collection to the Historical Society. And they took possession of it. That included the cabinets, all of the arrowheads, the Civil War memorabilia, which you can see today at the John Smart House. This is when the postcard collection goes missing. And so while we don't have any mention of the postcard collection in what has been published in the papers back then, we do know that it was a part of the original collection. It was not taken to the Medina County Historical Society, and nobody knows where it is today. So the rumor is that it was out there on the tree lawn, and somebody took the postcards and has them, and somewhere in a house in Wadsworth are the postcards. So if you know this, I'm not trying to start rumors, I'm just sharing ones I've already heard. Because it's important to find these postcards. They are thought to be one of the most prolific collections of photographs from that era, and so we would love to find out where they are so that they could be in the possession of the Historical Society or the library. At the end of that decade, Alice Woodard retired after 32 years of service, and the library then, as you get into the 60s, the library goes through a kind of almost rapid succession of directors, which is not uncommon when you have a really long-serving administrator or leader of any kind of organization. The next director was, his last name is McAvoy, George McAvoy. Does anybody remember George McAvoy? So right after George was only here for 2 years. She must have had quite the regime because he just didn't last very long. But the man who followed him, Kenneth Emmerich, he's the one who starts to bring the library into what I'm calling the modern age. He started putting policies and procedures in place and started using the techniques of modern management. If it's not measured, it's not managed. He improved the organization of the materials in the catalog. He brought the board into a new way of thinking about their role as trustees, as a governing and legislative body, and then started to professionalize the library in a way that had not been previously. Also in the 1960s, we start to see the expansion, the beginning of the bookmobile program, and that happened by the generosity and partnership of the Wadsworth City School District. Those bookmobiles originally were procured specifically to serve the schools, and that is what they did. At first, for the first decade and a half of that arrangement, the schools paid for and maintained the vehicles, and the library staffed the bookmobiles and also purchased the items that would circulate. And that lasted for 15 years in that way. And we get into the 70s, it transitions, and the library starts taking responsibility for the cost of operating the bookmobile, and the bookmobile starts doing more. You also see the beginning of new media. And so we've got the record collection. The library begins to bring other types of formats in. And that's a whole nother conversation. Maybe we could do a different program at some point just about the role of media in the evolution of the library, because it has been profound. And it even goes back to what I mentioned at the very beginning about the evolution of print and the transformation of the way that the printed word is published. In the 1970s, we just continue to see growth. There's a new director who ends up being the third longest serving director, Eileen Flowers. Does anybody remember Eileen? Did you work with her, Lucy?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay.
No, I can remember.
You remember Eileen? Yeah, Eileen did a lot of new things with the library. She started to extend the library in new ways. She also took the library through a challenging decade when the Medina County Library, District Library, was getting started. And there was a push to regionalize library services because the legislature had made this kind of county-wide library a possibility by a change in the Ohio Revised Code. But like many things, Wadsworth did not have an interest in being absorbed in a larger bureaucratic entity and lose local control, especially over their library. So after several years of consideration and then a year of direct negotiations with the Franklin Sylvester Library in Medina and the State Library of Ohio as a facilitator, the Library Board of Trustees decided not to join that consortium. Overall, the 70s is a time of growing programming in the library around reading, more and more story times. By this point, it is library staff delivering story times. You have the growth of the professional library degree and this modern period that begins with Kenneth Emmerich in the beginning of the 60s, just continues to move forward as the library tries to find ways to continue to do the traditional thing that it has always done and incorporate new methods of outreach to the community and new media formats. We then have the 1980s and the beginning of the computer age in the library. And this is when things really start to accelerate. You can see by the time you get to the 1980s, the amount of books that are circulating, the level of usage of the library is so strong that not just in Wadsworth, but in libraries throughout the state, all of a sudden there's a problem. People are reading so many books and they're circulating at such high levels and they need to buy new books to meet the demand, that they need to do something with the books they have to get rid of in order to make room for the new books. And this is a kind of new problem that happens in libraries in this modern period as their connection to the community and their circulation grow beyond a tipping point. This is when you see the growth of Friends of the Library groups throughout the state. And Wadsworth establishes theirs in 1980, and that is the purpose. The purpose of that Friends of the Library is to take those books and generate additional revenue by selling them, and also just creating a culture of volunteer support. The Friends, since the 1980s, have been a critical part of what the library does. It's not only about the books that they sell, but also the goodwill they generate in the community by the way that they do that. A lot of things happened in the 80s. By the time you get to just a couple years in, under Eileen Flower's leadership, the board recognizes that it's time to look at cataloging, digitization of the catalog, to think about other ways to extend community taxpayer dollars to get more resources in. And by '85, the decision is made to join the CleveNet consortium and be connected with the other libraries, which at first was not digital. It wasn't until 1987 that becomes a digitization project, and we get a catalog that is not yet a public internet connection, but a digital connection, a digital mediation of the catalog in the library, and then the librarians are calling and faxing each other to make the connection between their computer systems. So it's not yet an internet connected thing, but the catalog is brought into the digital age, and fax machines and phones are used to figure out which books to pull off the shelves and to ship them to the other libraries. That begins in the 80s. Around the end of the 80s, there's another renovation, so the library's growth continues. There are new uses. The uses continue to grow. More audiovisual materials. We're now circulating cassette tapes. The vinyl is faded by now. VHS is starting to come online. People are coming to the library for many different things, and so there is a need And you can see that computer there. That is not an internet connected computer. That is just an internal tool. Eileen Flowers saw the library through that transition, and the board of trustees at that time, you'll recognize Attorney Jim McIlvain is there, and I know that's Kathy Greckney and Frank Collins. Who is that? I'm quizzing you. You're the Historical Society.
But they weren't all here then.
I'm just teasing. So under Eileen's stewardship and the stewardship of the board, a lot of change is happening in the 80s. The building continues to evolve. The library adds Sunday hours, something that it actually had years and years ago. They come back again to meet the demand. And then there's a need to expand parking. So the lot that we now have over here on North Lyman was purchased and added as parking. In the 1990s, again, accelerating change. Now those computers that we put in place are starting to be used in different ways. At the same time that the technology is evolving, the library is continuing to reach out to the community. Outreach efforts are expanded. Another bookmobile is added, not to replace, but to expand the bookmobile service because it was so popular. The outreach department started doing books by mail and serving homebound patrons with direct access. And dial-up internet comes to the library, for better or worse, in the 1990s. But also, it's that trend of the modernization of the library, which is driving all of this, also brings us the first ever reference desk with a reference staff member. Well, before, the staff in the library were almost all jacks of all trade. Now you're starting to see kind of specialization happening that will continue throughout the 90s, especially under the leadership of Alan Nichols. We would have a teen library department and start to specialize by saying, all right, we need librarians not just to serve kids alone, we need them to think about different age groups and be more responsive directly to the needs of people at different stages of life, and breaking that out in a more granular way. The 2000s, well, before we get to the 2000s, I want to talk a little bit more about technology and outreach. In order to meet that demand with outreach, in the 90s, the library purchased the outreach building across the street on North Lyman. Does anybody know about the outreach building?
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know about it because it's really a staff operation to get the books out into the community. It's a 3-bay garage right over here on North Lyman that was renovated, purchased and renovated in the 1990s as part of this effort to expand outreach services. So there was a lot of growth happening in the 1990s. You can think about the developments that were happening in various parts of the community. As the community grew, the library grew in kind. By the end of the 90s, these VHS cassettes and books, there's some books mixed in with VHS here, and you can see the audio cassettes back there, start to make way for DVDs and CDs. And this is a period of massive increase of circulation. It's like circulation is increasing 20, 30% sometimes consistently as that media format was brought into the library mix. And in that period, from the late 90s until the mid 2000s, you see a broadening of the reach of people using the library that just was not happening before. More people are using the library for new and different ways, and this drives a need to expand the library. To this day, we are a library that is, when you compare us to our peers in the state of Ohio with similar types of population sizes and mix of density, we are per capita, we have a smaller footprint in terms of our shelving and public areas. Yet we turn our collection over at higher rates. So we are really well used. We are a lean, mean library, always have been. We've always been I think, stewarded in a conservative way in that way. I know some folks look at the building, and maybe back in 2000 it seemed extravagant to folks. It could have been bigger, but it was a conservative investment and continues to be. But that was a necessary thing. The library was bursting at the seams. There were, Lucy, you were here for that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and there were books stacked on top of books. Shelves were over brimming, and people were on top of each other. It was a well-loved and well-utilized space, and it needed to grow. And so in 2000, or 1999 was when a ballot issue was first introduced for a $1 million, 15-year improvement bond issue, and an additional 5-year tax levy that did not pass. So the board went back to the drawing table and was able to bring something to the community in 2000 that did pass, a 22-year, $5.6 million bond issue that did pay for that expansion and renovation in the 2000s. I was going back over when we started this most recent construction project, this minor compared to what was done back then by measures. I went back through the old meeting minutes of that construction, and the day the first meeting for that construction was on September 11th, when that building was expanded. They were in the meeting with the architects getting ready to start the project, and it's even in the notes that they were interrupted to go see what was happening. So just think about how quickly time flies, but a challenging decade, I'll say, that started with promise, and also by the time we get to the end of the decade, the library is making some tough decisions. In the very beginning, that renovation that was completed by Spice Constantino Architects and the Rulin Company, whom we worked with again most recently, more than doubled the public space, added these meeting rooms that we have today, finally got the children's area up into its own sequestered area so they can be as loud as they need to be. And they do need to be loud. Expanded the audiovisual area and all of the amenities that you all know today. I won't bore you with things that you know about. I'll recap these last sections fairly briefly. I mentioned that 9/11 at the very beginning because we all know that the dot-com bubble followed not too many years later the housing crisis and the international financial crisis, the Great Recession. So by 2008, after those first 8 years of growth in usage, the library had to start to make cuts because of cuts from state funding. And this library has always been a shrewd steward of your resources, and it did what needed to be done. The board and the administrative team and staff here began to scale back services and pare back, knowing that it was going to take some time before it would be appropriate to ask the community for more funding to help restore services. But that comes in the 2010s. Luckily for me, the blessing for me anyway, that I came in as the new director in 2013 after the team here and the board had asked the community for a $1 million 5-year levy to start to restore those resources. And that levy passed with strong support from the public. And so I had the great privilege to work with the Board of Trustees and the community and the staff to start to rebuild some of those services. And some of the things that we were able to do in the 2010s were to reinvest in the collections. And we saw between 2015 and 2017 a rise in circulation, and more profoundly a rise in programming, attendance, and participation. And so by the time we got to the end of that decade, we were looking at what could we do to meet the needs of these families and library patrons in new ways. And so we worked with a group out of Arizona, actually, that builds interactive library play areas with an idea that the purpose of this play area is actually to try to fight the trend that's happening with screen use. that kids are becoming less and less tactile, and that lack of tactility actually interrupts the proper development of gross and fine motor skills in the mind. There's a mind-body connection that's related to reading. And so we worked with our foundation to fund the installation of this program and to complete construction and make room for it underneath the cupola there on the second floor, and introduced and really started thinking more and more critically about the urgency of early literacy for children. Whereas in the past, early literacy was always important, it never seemed so under attack in terms of its competition with other media and also the consequences of what happens when children don't have that kind of access. So we were able to achieve that and refocus on the children, and while continuing to provide services to folks of all ages. And so what do the 2020s hold? Well, at the beginning, it wasn't looking great. During the COVID shutdown, I'm proud to say that our team, given the independence that we have as an independent library, not part of a larger system, and this is not a criticism of larger systems, they just have more layers they have to work through. We were able to be one of the first libraries open in our region again, circulating books again, and we were able to adapt in a way that we were able to balance our specific community's needs and to restore those services quicker than others were able to restore because of that local connection. But as we've come out of that, we're in a new world where people are more and more using screens. And screens have their use, and they definitely are going to play a role in whatever happens in the future. At the same time, we are the keepers of a tradition of reading that fosters a kind of attention and intelligence that we frankly need. And so we're kind of in a process of revisiting that and how we recommit to that. We're working with, right now, a consultant from the publishing industry out of the UK, of all places, who has made a really compelling argument about how there is an untapped market for reading that we as libraries, as an industry, have missed. And we want to test that hypothesis until we've proven it wrong. So we're working on that. We've done some early tests with some different ways of collecting the books, of selecting the books, and have seen the early result is a 32% increase in our young adult circulation by applying different methods and using different market data that we did not have before. And so we're going to be working over the next year to extend that method to other areas of our collection, and really, this is not an anti-technology stance. It's one that folks are talking about the problem of not being able to tolerate boredom. Folks are talking about the inundation of digital distractions. And we want to, while we continue to have digital inputs to the library and access and even services, we also want to make sure that that traditional thing that we've been doing now for 100 years, that we do it very well, and that we make it very easy for you to do something that is not digital as well. So we'll be focusing on that over the coming months and year here. And the most recent renovation that we completed was really about trying to make more of our staff space more publicly accessible, given that we are small for our population size. We want to work within the footprint and make the building last as long as we possibly can. And so we've done that in a way to add more community meeting space. We have a new multi-purpose room now that connects out to our courtyard that certainly the Historical Society could utilize, and other community groups, more study areas. We've seen an increase in young adults come in to study at the library. And so we'll be working with that and trying to figure out new ways to serve that traditional need while sustaining some of these new partnerships that we have developed over the years. How many of you were able to be here for our 100th anniversary? I don't want you to watch my speech. This is really queued up to the Ella M. Everhard reenactment speech. So those of you who were not here, we had a Wadsworth native actor, Elena Tennant, reenact a speech that was given on the very day the library was opened. It was printed in the newspaper back in 1926.
Dear friends, we are here tonight because we are interested in our community. This is a sort of housewarming affair. We are here to see how our friends, these good books, look in their new home after having had occupied a rented house for so long. Those of us who have been interested in establishing a library in Wadsworth judged rightly, I think, in purchasing the books first, for books are more important than building. The library in America dates back to a time soon after the Puritans landed at Plymouth Rock. They founded a college and with it a library. But the organized effort for the plans of library improvement began in 1876 with the formation of the American Library Association. Library methods and relationship of the library to the community have undergone radical changes in the past few years. A Harvard librarian was asked some 80 years ago how things fared with him, and he replied, "Oh, rarely good. Every book is in except one, and I am on my way to go get it." It is our hope that this home will be attractive enough to induce both children and adults to come in often, to browse around and carry something to be read in the home. For it truly has been said that the library, along with the public school, is the university of the town. It is the business of the school to begin one's education, but not to end it. At their commencement time, the student is merely equipped with mental tools to go on with their growth in power and usefulness throughout life. But to grow, they must come in contact with new ideas and new information. Giving this contact is the business of the library. The library is an integral part in public education. We want it to be a place where the merchants can get information that will help them, where a child can get help in building an aeroplane or constructing a radio apparatus, where the parent can get help in conducting their home and rearing the children, and where the scholar and student can find help in their work. We want it to be a place where all classes can come for help and for recreation. You know, some people evidently consider a library to be a quite desirable and slightly useful ornament to have in their town, but which they themselves never enter. It is to be hoped that every man, woman, and child will get in the library habit if they haven't already. The library should be considered a public utility in the same way that the waterworks is a public utility. We want water. We do not wonder where we will get it. We turn on the faucet and draw the water. When we want information, ideas, inspiration, we have them on tap at the library. Why not consider the library a public utility even as we do our light and water plants? As a democratic institution, the public library stands alone. In it, all classes are on equal footing and no distinctions are made. We want it to serve the more intellectual members of our community, certainly, but the circle of its borrowers should expand until the less educated and less trained come within its influence. It should be not only the university, but also the secondary and elementary school. It is with some such ideal in mind that this property has been presented to Wadsworth. I have just one request to make. I would like the name of this library changed. I have protested the name in the first place. I know and appreciate the motive of my friends to perpetuate my name. I feel highly honored. I am proud of my friends and I do thank them. I know too that those friends who know me now will not forget. To those who do not know me, and to those who will come in the after years, my name will signify but little. I feel grateful to the citizens too who gave so liberally of their means so that this building could be remodeled and equipped to make it the real library that you see today. I have lived in Wadsworth for many years. I have watched it grow with interest and pride. Our residences, Our places of business, our factories are on par, if not a little above, the towns of its size. The country and scenery around town in every direction is beautiful. We have fine churches. Our school buildings are better than most towns of its size. We have splendid musical, literary, and dramatic talent. I know you would agree with me if you could attend some of the meetings of our women's club, where every literary club in town and in the country can belong, and every lady, whether a member of a literary club or not, can become a member by posing a small fee. I think our Constitution could be worded in such a way that men could also become honorary members by posing a larger fee. And I know that they would enjoy the programs as well as receive a benefit. I love Wadsworth and its people, and I would like to honor both the town and its inhabitants by naming this building the Wadsworth Public Library. Thank you.
And she did just a phenomenal job of portraying the spirit of Ella M. Everhard. And I've read that speech half a dozen times or more, and it never came to life like when this young lady read it and brought out the humor, the character, the integrity, and the humility of this woman. And I think what I would just like to close with is that if we can keep that spirit in mind and try to preserve that as we think about the future and do the things the library is charged to do here in the community, if we can keep that as our North Star and recognize that that is truly a tradition that goes back to the very taproot of this community and its early settlement, that we cannot do wrong. Yeah, and I'll just end with, we really hope one of the aspirations for the new local history room is that we don't forget to be chroniclers of the history that's happening today. That is vitally important. And to make sure that we get the stories of those who are living and have memories of older eras, it's vitally important. I could get on a soapbox about it, that we're in this culture that's become so consumer-oriented and so oriented around brands and almost national and transnational kind of identities for products. It's almost like we bring kids into a world where they are led to believe that your local history doesn't matter. It's just another place. Everywhere I go, I see the same signs. Everywhere I go, I can buy the same things. But it does matter profoundly. And it matters in a really immediate and simple way, who we are and who came before us. And we have a role to preserve that here at the library, like you do in the Historical Society. We do that together. And that comes back to stories and storytelling. That's something that we'll talk about another time, I think. But it's related to the evolution of print technology and industrialization and the role of a library, how libraries have evolved in a bigger picture. I wanted to talk tonight just about a glimpse of the library's history here in Wadsworth, but there's a bigger dynamic that I think deserves attention that I'd love to talk with you about. Well, I thank you all for being here tonight and giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit. Yeah.